At its peak, the Mauryan Empire spanned 5 million square kilometers, held together by a permanent standing army of 600,000 soldiers. Yet the architect of that empire, Chandragupta Maurya, ended his life by becoming a barefoot monk, sitting on a stone floor and voluntarily refusing food until his body gave out. To understand that choice, we have to look back to the world he was born into in the 320s BCE. The Indian subcontinent was caught in a geographic vice. In the east, the deeply unpopular Nanda dynasty squeezed its population with cruel taxation. In the northwest, the invasion of Alexander the Great shattered local kingdoms and left behind a chaotic trail of fractured, volatile territories. The collision of a cruel eastern regime and a destabilized western frontier created a massive power vacuum. It provided the exact conditions required for someone with enough strategic foresight to build a centralized state from scratch. That foresight belonged to Chanakya, a political strategist who had been publicly humiliated and expelled from the Nanda court. Seeking revenge against the dynasty, Chanakya scoured the region for an instrument he could mold. He found it in an impoverished, fatherless boy named Chandragupta, whom he discovered naturally organizing local children into mock kingdoms. Chanakya brought the boy to the famous Takshashila University for 8 years of grueling preparation. Chandragupta was taught to command cavalry and war elephants, but he also studied economics, espionage, the management of state treasuries, and complex military logistics. Once his education was complete, the two men moved to exploit the post-Alexander chaos in the northwest. They gathered a rogue force, recruiting warlike forest tribes, mercenaries, prisoners of war, and unpaid Nanda soldiers into a highly motivated army. Chanakya ensured his students' rise was no accident. By 18, Chandragupta was a precision tool, trained to apply the Arthasastra's cold logic to every aspect of the state. Their first attempt to take the Nanda Empire was a disaster. They marched their newly formed army straight into the center of the empire, directly attacking the massive Nanda capital. They were crushed by a vastly superior force and barely escaped with their lives. Legend says the shift in their approach came from watching a woman scold her child for eating from the center of a hot dish. Chanakya saw the metaphor immediately. To avoid being burned, they had to start from the cooler periphery. They implemented a strict periphery-first campaign. They secured the volatile northwestern regions to build their ranks. Then, Chanakya deployed a sophisticated spy network to bribe Nanda officials and encourage defections. By the time Chandragupta's forces finally surrounded the capital, they were strangling a regime that had already hollowed out from the inside. The largest empire in ancient India fell because Chandragupta and Chanakya prioritized psychological subversion and geographic patience over brute force. Once the east was secured, a massive external threat arrived in 305 BCE. Seleucus Nicator, one of Alexander the Great's most capable successors, marched a Macedonian Greek army across the Indus River to reclaim the eastern territories. Expecting easy conquests, Seleucus instead collided with a battle-hardened Mauryan military. Chandragupta deployed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and relied heavily on armored war elephants, a tactic that completely shattered the Greek formations. The defeat forced the Treaty of the Indus. Chandragupta handed over 500 war elephants, and in return, Seleucus ceded a staggering 500,000 square kilometers of territory, expanding the Mauryan borders deep into modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. Expelling a successor of Alexander the Great transformed the Mauryan state. Chandragupta was no longer a local rebel. He was the head of a superpower capable of dictating terms to the Mediterranean world. Sustaining a 5 million square kilometer empire required an exhaustive economic machine. The state owned all mines, regulated markets with price controls, and claimed up to a quarter of all agricultural produce in taxes. The administration of this massive wealth was dictated by Chanakya's Arthashastra, a political treatise that laid out a highly regulated, deeply paranoid framework for ruling a state. Following this manual, Chandragupta worked 16 hours a day. He slept in a different, randomly selected bedroom every night. He was surrounded by female warrior bodyguards, and multiple people had to test his food for poison before he would take a single bite. He possessed absolute control over the subcontinent, but the daily reality of maintaining that grip cost him his own psychological freedom. In his later years, the heavy burden of constant vigilance and the inherent violence of his reign began to wear on him. He started spending time with Bhadrabahu, a highly revered monk from the Jain tradition. Bhadrabahu introduced him to the Jain principle of ahimsa, strict nonviolence. For a man whose entire existence had been defined by military conquest and ruthless political calculation, this philosophy triggered a profound crisis of conscience. In 298 BCE, controlling the most powerful throne in Asia, Chandragupta made a choice with little historical precedent. He abdicated, handing the empire to his son Bindusara to live as a landless Jain monk. His abdication was a radical departure from the violence of his youth. By walking away from the palace, he rejected the very concept of material ownership as the source of authority. Stripped of his identity, the former emperor walked thousands of kilometers south alongside his teacher. The man who once commanded hundreds of thousands of troops now slept on bare dirt and begged for his meals. At Shravanabelagola, he undertook Salikana, a sacred Jain practice of voluntary fasting to death. Over several weeks, he slowly eliminated his food intake, spending his final days in deep meditation until he passed away peacefully on a hilltop. The political machine he left behind thrived. His son expanded the borders, and his grandson, Ashoka the Great, would go on to rule nearly the entire subcontinent, leaving a cultural impact that shapes India to this day. Alexander the Great died at 32, reportedly weeping because there were no new worlds to conquer. Chandragupta Maurya died at Shravanabelagola, having walked away from the one he already owned.